Well, hello there. Thank you for joining in tonight. This is Recharging with Charlotte, and this is just a quick little podcast where I get to share some really fun stories from my past, both in mortgage and also in my history. And tonight we're going to have a really fun time going over some of the crazy cash explanations. So, as most of you know, I've been in the mortgage industry for over 20 years. I'm not going to date myself with the exact number, but long time. Been doing mortgages for most of my adult life, that's for sure. And with that, we've seen lots of change, but one of the big changes has been explaining cash to close. So, if you've got a mortgage in the last 7, 8 years, maybe even 10 years, you know that the bank started asking for explanations for cash deposits into your bank account. So later on in this little show, we will go into why we ask for that because it's actually a pretty interesting story in itself. And I lived through a lot of it. So that's always fun. But also, I'm going to share some of the most crazy, most illegal, and hilarious stories that I have had for reasons that people had large deposits in their bank account. So let's start with one of my very favorite stories. So, again, when you're buying a mortgage, we get bank statements, right? And when we get those bank statements, us, the lender, is charged. We are responsible to make sure that we have explained any large deposits that didn't come from your work, right? Or didn't come from the sale of a home that we've got documented. So let's start with one of my very favorite stories. This was one of my very first loans that I had sent over to me when I got back into mortgages after the big crash, and I got out of mortgages for a couple years. I came back in. I think it was my third client back. So here I am. I'm getting ready to do a USDA loan. And folks, just so you know, USDA makes you document every deposit into your bank that doesn't come from your actual income. So they're super picky. $2, we've got to explain where it comes from. That's because they're wanting to know, we'll get into that again, but they're wanting to make sure that there is no other income that isn't being used, right? So here I have this USDA client and he's got a deposit. It was $500, which is definitely something that we have to source. If anybody's on here and you are familiar with USDA, you know that you've got to source all of those deposits. And I say, hey, so tell me about this deposit. I've got to source it. Tell me where that came from. It doesn't look like it was from your work. And he says, you don't want to know. Like, this could get bad. Okay, tell me more. I'm sure we can find a way around it. Tell me what you got. He goes, well, on the weekends, I might do some cockfighting. Now, I'm from Kentucky, lived in Tennessee at the time, and I feel like, I'm pretty familiar with all of the things that go around, and I had heard that people do cockfighting, but had never met anybody that actually did this. And I'm like, well, what do you mean you have $500 from cockfighting? That doesn't make sense. Well, lo and behold, this income came from betting on some cockfighting and winning. He says he's very good at betting on the right rooster. Is that right? Rooster's chicken, a cock? I don't know. Whatever. So this is illegal funds, right? This is not something you're legally allowed to do. You're not allowed to gamble on cockfighting, not even in Tennessee. Sorry, folks. So we did have to wait and let that fall way off and tell him not to do any more cockfighting because one of the reasons that we have to source down payment money and source money that goes into your bank is to make sure it does not come from illegal places, right? So cockfighting, sadly, is illegal. So that's one of the reasons that as mortgage bankers and as a mortgage company and as you're getting a mortgage, we require you to explain these deposits. It is to one, the government would like us to monitor and make sure it's coming from legal sources. So let's dive into that a little bit more. Then I'll tell you another great story of a legal great large deposit that came in. I have invited the person that this happened. I'm not sure if she's here, but I hope so. I always tell her she's got my favorite large deposit story. But one of the reasons, there's a couple of reasons that the federal government requires us to monitor these large deposits. And one of them is to make sure that it is not money laundering. So how does that even make sense? And this took me a while to really wrap my head around it. And a couple of years back, it was explained to me. So here's the deal. Back in the good old days, back prior 2007, when we did not have to source deposits, right? Back in the time, in my lifetime, in my mortgage time, we could have large deposits on bank accounts. We didn't even ask where the money was really coming from. So people like, oh, I don't know, drug dealers, terrorists, big crime could literally take $100,000 and use that as a down payment on a $400,000 or $500,000 house, maybe a $200,000 house. It doesn't matter. But they could take that illegitimate cash and bring it to closing and use that for down payment, and then sell the house down the road or pull the money out with a equity line of credit or a second mortgage or refinancing. And they have legitimized that cash, right? They have taken their money that was not legitimate, it was cash. They have now filtered it through the system. And now when they go to spend it or deposit it, it's no longer a red flag with the federal government. So that is one reason why now the good guys have to go through lots of annoying paperwork when it comes to sourcing down payments. So let's go into a story that is one of my very favorite stories for what this large deposit is. And I can't remember the exact amount. I want to say it was 11,000, maybe 16,000, somewhere in that area. There was this large deposit on one of my clients' bank statements. And this is a wonderful client. I've worked with her many a times. She actually is an agent that I work with as well. And she was moving here from out of town. So I figured she had either sold a house or something there, and I just needed to source it. And she says, no. I sold a zebra. Like, you what? you sold a zebra. I thought she was joking. Nope. True story. My client had actually sold a zebra. She had a couple of cool exotic animals, and she had sold a zebra and deposited because, one, she was moving from out of state and she didn't want to move the zebra. It was easier just to sell it. And two, it helped for cash for down payment. So I'm completely at a loss. I call my underwriter. We are cracking up at the fact that of all of the things that we have for letters of explanation for down payments, zebra has never come up. Turns out that with exotic animals, they're actually like registered. They have license just like a car. I was completely able to document the sale. We got the proof that she owned the zebra through this exotic license. We have the bill of sale showing that she legitimately sold the zebra. And lo and behold, we had great proof of deposit, and we were able to use those funds. And I always tell her that is my very favorite story. Nobody has beat the zebra. That's the absolute best. That's the best down payment money ever. I mean, it's just unique, and I love it. So let's go into the other reason why we started having to really source these down payments. So the federal government is really looking to make sure that the money that is being used for down payment isn't coming from the seller. And that sounds bizarre. Like, why in the world would the seller give money for down payment? Anybody here watching in the mortgage industry or the real estate industry back in 2004 and 5 and 6 when these rules weren't in effect? If you are, you know why we have to make sure that the money didn't come from the seller, because guys, it was coming from the seller. So here's what that looked like. And I can attest that I was definitely a part of many of these transactions. It wasn't even wrong at the time. So buyer wants to buy a house. Their credit score is in the pooper. It's horrible. 560 credit score, 540 credit score. They only qualify for a loan with, 20% down. Because back in the day, if you had a 520 credit score, hadn't paid a bill on time in your entire life, Wells Fargo or Long Beach would still do a mortgage for you as long as you had a large down payment. And they didn't care where that down payment came from. So let's just say we want to buy a house for $80,000. Haha, back in the day, maybe that was possible. We want to buy a house for $80,000 and our seller wants to sell. And they're like, well, the buyer's agent might say, hey, will you guys if we buy it for $100,000, will you guys give $20,000 for the down payment? They're still making their $80,000. And back in those days, the loan officer could pick up the phone and say, hey, Mr. Appraiser, I need this house appraised for $100,000. Can you make it appraised for $100,000? And back then, they probably could. There was not many restraints on what an appraiser could and couldn't do, and all of these houses were going for higher and higher and higher values. So it would work. They would absolutely be able to go in. They might do a seller's second, or they might just give money. Yeah, it's a great idea, Eric. It's why it's not legal anymore. It was an amazing idea. Back in the day when we were churning and house values were skyrocketing, it worked. But part of what happened in 2008 was, guess what? That market that was just churning and churning and churning and churning, people stopped paying, people lost jobs, the market went down just this much. Well, those appraised values were inflated. Guys, they were really inflated because the seller was giving them their down payment. So it really wasn't down payment. So our buyers had absolutely no skin in the game, right? Yeah, what could possibly go wrong? They had no skin in the game. They could walk away and they hadn't really lost anything. Our sellers got away with what they wanted, and now we have a house that appraised for 100,000 that was really only sold for 80,000. Our system was jacked up, and lo and behold, it crashed. All it took was those values to just dip down that much, and suddenly we had the mortgage crash on our hand. So the CFPB and all of their wisdom, this was actually a really good call for them. And I understand why they have this rule. One, we're not allowed to call and talk to appraisers anymore. Weird. Imagine how now it's a little bit crazy. Like, we can't even pick up the phone and just say, hey to appraiser right now. It's got to go through all these different channels so that we're not dictating value, which makes sense, right? So that's one of the safety things that we've got. But also, they have made a rule that we have to source the deposits and source down payment money before we get to closing to make sure that it did not come from an interested party, being the builder or the seller. Oh, and guys, let me just tell you, builders, we did so many builders. Sevierville and that Tennessee area was notorious for builders going in. They would find straw borrowers who would go in, they would give them the cash for the down payment and flip these properties. And at the end, when the bottom fell out, I mean, millions upon millions of dollars of foreclosures because the values were really never there. So that's another reason why we have to source down payments. So let's get into another funny story. This is something that happened to somebody on my team a couple years back. This was probably, it could have been a very illegal situation. We didn't ask many questions, but when we asked for a verification of a $10,000 deposit, $10,000 that went into this person's bank account, they said, well, I'm not really supposed to talk about it. That's always a worrisome answer, but we have to dig in. So she's like, well, I was given $10,000 hush money from my ex-employer to not talk. That's all they were allowed to say. Now, I have no idea what the reason was. She wasn't allowed to say. And it wasn't legal hush money. It wasn't like the courts ordered this money. This was just actual hush money. So that's always a fun story just because I don't know what happened. So my imagination is like, oh, what happened? What was that company doing? Of course, we're researching on the web to see if there's any fun stories about that company. We didn't find any really, but it was still a fun story. And we, in our head, had all kinds of great reasons. We watched way too many movies at our office. That was a good one. We had a son of Biden story. I think it was Biden's son that got in all kinds of trouble for artwork. I definitely had somebody say that they sold artwork, which would be completely legitimate and totally fine as long as we could document it. That was not documentable. So sadly, that did not work. Yeah, right. Everybody was hushed. So yes, the artwork did not work. It could. So if you have artwork, I've got some artwork that if I needed some cash, I could go sell it. Not my own personal, I'm not that good, but I have purchased some artwork, which comes with a bill of sale. It comes with an appraisal. You can do all that and make it legitimate, right? This client, not sure what that artwork really was, but lo and behold, it was not traceable. And they had got like $30,000 for some artwork. So I'm very curious as to what that could be. Still, that loan did not close with that bank statement. We had to find a different way of getting some funds in the bank. I think we got a gift on that one. I did have somebody say that their ex-boyfriend had given them cash that was from selling drugs, and that's why they broke up with him. That's a great story. I mean, at least they did break up. That's good, I guess. and then last but not least, this story turned out to be completely legitimate, but I had a client say, well, that cash came from this person overseas. And whenever this story starts with that, my mind immediately goes to, was it like a prince? Like, are we talking about a prince that's given you money and you're supposed to pay them back? I thought for sure I was getting ready to break this person's heart with this $50,000 that they had deposited. Good news, it was actually a family member from overseas and it was a legitimate deposit, but talk about a nightmare to trace. Guys, when you're trying to track money that comes from overseas, that's one of the things that we have to do. It's very important that we make sure that there is not money that is illegal or laundering or terrorist funding, right? Yeah, so getting that verified was a nightmare, but we stuck in there. We got some translators, we got bank statements from other banks, and we were able to make it work. So, there are some crazy stories for you for our crazy cash and why we need it. Makes sense. Sucks that the good guys do have to, you know, make up for the bad guys. That's kind of how it happens. Some reason my chat just went away, so I can't see you. Sorry, guys. But good guys are having to make up for some bad things that happened in the past. Hope that sheds some light on why we have to nickel and dime you. Oh, real quick, I didn't share USDA. So USDA and other programs that are income based, meaning USDA, you have to make under a certain amount of income. So not only are they wanting to make sure that your money's not illegal and that your money's not from the seller, but they're also wanting to make sure that you're not hiding income that would disqualify you from a subsidized program. So that is one other caveat. So I think we've covered all the caveats as to why we must verify the dollars and cents that go into your bank account. Hey, if you were thinking about buying in the next couple of months, and this was something you were questioning because you might have some cash flow that goes in and out of your bank, there are specific rules about specific programs. My team would be glad to help. So please, absolutely send me a message if you have questions about your own personal situation. There is normally a way of documenting it, unless you're cockfighting. Cockfighting, we can't document. Illegal gambling is off the table. We can't do anything with that. Stop doing it for a couple of months and let's clean up those bank statements. I hope that this was helpful and made you laugh a little bit. And until next time, we'll be here next week, Tuesday, 6 o'clock again, Central Standard Time. Next week, I'm going to share some stories. These are shenanigans part 1 of things that Charlotte did when she was a young adult that if her children did, she would kill. I think we probably all as parents have maybe had a couple of those stories. But I'm going to do part 1 of that next week. I hope you all will join me. Thank you again for coming along with Recharging with Charlotte. Have a good night, everybody.